The first thing she noticed was how casually they moved. September 1944. Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Behind the chain-link fences of the prisoner compound, Erika Weber, once a communications officer in the Wehrmacht, stood watching American infantrymen on the training field. To her eyes, sharpened by years of German military discipline, the scene unfolding looked like farce. Soldiers who did not march in perfect unison. Squads that drifted apart and reformed without command, barked in parade ground cadence. Movements that lacked the crisp, mechanical precision she had been drilled to regard as the very essence of soldiering. They looked like farmers playing at soldiers, she muttered, gesturing toward the field. The other German prisoners laughed bitterly, sharing the same arrogance. After all, they had been told for years that American success came only from material advantage. More tanks, more planes, more ships, never from superior soldiers. The Wehrmacht, they still believed, was unmatched in discipline, training, and martial spirit. To them, these Americans seemed like amateurs in uniforms. Nothing more. Yet, across the wire, the men they mocked were preparing for war in the Pacific. Some would soon fight on islands whose names were not yet etched into history books. And their apparent sloppiness was not weakness. It was something else, something Erika did not yet understand, but was about to confront. What neither she nor her fellow prisoners realized was that they were about to become part of an extraordinary experiment. The U.S. Army, confident in its methods, would allow enemy officers to observe training firsthand. Not propaganda films, not lectures, but the raw, unfiltered drills and exercises that prepared Americans for combat. Colonel Morrison, the officer in charge of Fort Leavenworth's prisoner compound, put it simply, if you believe our soldiers are inferior, then you have nothing to lose by watching. Judge us by results, not appearances. It was an offer laced with irony for Erika, who had once gathered intelligence for the German military. It sounded like an invitation to confirm her prejudices. She was certain she would return to her barracks, with pages of notes documenting every flaw in American training. But what she did not know was that those very notes would become the undoing of her lifelong beliefs and, in time, the blueprint for rebuilding a new German military after the war. Because this is not just the story of one officer in captivity. It is the story of two worlds colliding, two visions of how armies should be trained, how soldiers should fight, and ultimately, how wars are won. One world clung to rigid obedience, absolute control, and the machine-like synchronization of parade ground perfection. The other embraced adaptability, initiative, and the uncomfortable idea that even the lowest-ranking soldier might need to think for himself when the chaos of battle shattered the chain of command. And the outcome of that clash did not stay within the fences of Fort Leavenworth. It reached far beyond to the collapse of Nazi Germany, to the reshaping of NATO doctrines, and even to modern conflicts where the same question still echoes. Which matters more, obedience or initiative? But before we get to the collapse of certainty and the painful awakening of a captured officer, let's step back to truly understand why Erika Weber mocked what she saw that September morning. We must first look at the world she came from, the traditions that shaped her, the propaganda that misled her, and the war that was already tearing her beliefs apart. To understand why Erika Weber was so certain of German superiority that morning in Kansas, we need to step back into the world that shaped her. Germany in 1944 was a nation teetering on the edge of defeat, though many of its officers and soldiers refused to believe it. Only a few months earlier, Allied forces had stormed the beaches of Normandy, breaking open Hitler's fortress Europe. From there, the Allies had surged inland, overwhelming German divisions that had once been regarded as the finest fighting force in the world. Amid that chaos, Weber and dozens of other female personnel were captured. But captivity did not erase the beliefs the Wehrmacht had drilled into them. For years, German soldiers had been taught that theirs was the most disciplined, most professional army in history. The Prussian legacy loomed large. Rigid formations, absolute obedience, and the idea that soldiers were cogs in a perfectly engineered machine. Training punished even minor deviations from uniformity. To falter in synchronization during a drill was not a small mistake, it was a failure of character. This culture of precision extended far beyond parade grounds. Wehrmacht officers were trained to issue detailed orders and expected them to be executed exactly, without question. A soldier's worth was measured not by how well he solved problems, but by how completely he obeyed. The machine, they believed, functioned best when each part played its role without improvisation. Against this backdrop, American soldiers looked like amateurs. To the Germans, the U.S. Army's relaxed formations and emphasis on individual initiative seemed like laziness. The idea that enlisted men might speak up, question orders, or make independent decisions on the battlefield was not just foreign, it was heresy. And yet, the battlefield realities of World War II were already exposing the limits of this rigid philosophy. Consider Normandy itself. German defenders fought ferociously, but their command system was so centralized that even local commanders often had to wait for approval from higher headquarters before responding to unexpected situations. American and British forces, meanwhile, adapted quickly to shifting terrain, broken communications, and chaotic encounters. While German units clung to their orders, Allied troops improvised and survived. The difference was not only tactical, but cultural. The U.S. military reflected the values of the society it came from. America was a nation built on the frontier, where self-reliance was essential. It was a democracy where citizens expected their voices to matter. Soldiers brought those expectations with them into the ranks. Training emphasized adaptability because Americans, by nature, resisted blind obedience. Across the ocean, the Soviet Union provided another extreme example. There, discipline was enforced with fear. Soldiers were often ordered to hold positions at all costs, even when tactically suicidal. Initiative was not just discouraged, but punished. As political commissars loomed behind the lines, the Red Army eventually triumphed through sheer numbers and willingness to absorb staggering losses. But the human cost was catastrophic. The British Army, meanwhile, had evolved a middle ground, shaped by years of colonial warfare and experience against both conventional and irregular enemies. British doctrine stressed the importance of small unit initiative, particularly among non-commissioned officers, though it retained more formal rigidity than the Americans. Each army reflected its nation's values: Germany, hierarchy and precision; the Soviet Union, mass obedience; Britain, cautious flexibility; America, bold initiative. By late 1944, these competing philosophies were no longer academic. They were being tested on every battlefield across Europe and the Pacific. And despite all the propaganda, German officers like Erika Weber still clung to. The results were becoming undeniable. The Wehrmacht's rigid perfection had not prevented retreat after retreat. German soldiers were still disciplined, still determined, but their very obedience sometimes led them into disaster. That was the unspoken tension behind Weber's confidence as she looked across the training fields at Fort Leavenworth. She still believed in the superiority of German training, because she had been raised to believe it. But reality was already undermining that faith. And now, by a twist of fate, she was about to confront the contrast directly, not on a battlefield, but as a captive forced to watch the training of the enemy. Colonel Morrison's program of observation might have seemed like a simple cultural experiment. In truth, it was an extraordinary gamble. What army in history had ever allowed enemy officers to study its training methods up close? It was a gesture born not of arrogance, but of quiet confidence. The Americans believed that what looked like chaos to the Germans was in fact strength. Strength forged not on parade grounds, but in the unpredictable crucible of real war. What Weber and her fellow prisoners were about to witness was not just drills and exercises. It was a clash of philosophies that would reveal why one army was advancing toward victory while the other was crumbling into defeat. And for Erika Weber, who had spent her life believing that precision equaled power, the coming days would mark the slow unraveling of everything she thought she knew about military excellence. The morning air at Fort Leavenworth carried a faint chill, but the sun was already rising, burning away the mist that clung to the fields. A group of German prisoners, including Erika Weber, stood silently at the edge of the wire, their eyes fixed on the movement beyond. On the training ground, squads of American infantry were assembling for exercises. To the Germans, it was a bewildering sight. Men adjusted their belts while chatting casually, rifles slung loosely across shoulders. Squads gathered without the sharp commands that Weber was accustomed to. Instead of snapping into position, the Americans drifted into loose groups, laughing and gesturing as if preparing for a picnic rather than combat training. Erika folded her arms, suppressing a smirk. Discipline, she whispered to the woman beside her, is clearly not their strong suit. She was not alone in her disdain. For years, Wehrmacht doctrine had drilled into its soldiers that discipline was the essence of military power. Precision on the parade ground translated, they believed, into discipline under fire. Every synchronized step, every flawless turn was a reflection of unity, an army acting as one mind, one body. Watching the Americans now, the prisoners saw only disorder. But Colonel Morrison, standing nearby, caught the murmurs of contempt. His face betrayed nothing as he motioned for Captain Williams, the officer overseeing the observation, to step forward. Ladies and gentlemen, Williams began, addressing the group of German officers and auxiliaries. What you are seeing is not indiscipline. It is efficiency. We do not waste time polishing boots to perfection or drilling endless hours on parade grounds. We focus on what wins battles. Weber raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She was not convinced. The whistle blew, and the first exercise began. Squads broke off and moved toward a wooded section of the field. To the untrained eye, it looked chaotic soldiers darting in different directions, groups splitting apart and reforming. German officers watching shook their heads. In their system, such disorder would earn punishment. Williams leaned toward the group. Notice something. Each squad leader knows the mission, but not every step is dictated. If a soldier sees an opportunity, he acts. If terrain changes, they adapt. That's not chaos, it's initiative. Erika frowned. In the Wehrmacht, initiative was reserved for officers. And even then, only within carefully defined boundaries. Here, she was being told that ordinary soldiers could alter the course of action. To her, that sounded reckless, even dangerous. One American soldier, separated from his squad, crawled through tall grass to flank a target. Weber pointed him out. He is out of position. In our army, such behavior would be punished. Williams smiled. In ours, it might earn him a commendation if it achieves the objective. The Germans laughed, dismissing the explanation. To them, it sounded like an excuse for poor training. But then came the debrief. The squad leaders gathered their men, discussing openly what had gone well and what had failed. Even privates spoke up, suggesting improvements. Weber was startled. In the Wehrmacht, critique flowed in one direction downward, never upward. Soldiers did not question officers. Here, the Americans encouraged dialogue, Still, Weber clung to her beliefs. An army that allows soldiers to talk back, she told herself, cannot be strong. But beneath her certainty, a sliver of doubt had begun to form. The Americans were not punished for their apparent disorder. Instead, they were encouraged to learn from it. Their mistakes were not weaknesses to be hidden, but lessons to be shared. For the first time, Weber wondered if what she had dismissed as sloppiness was something else, entirely something she could not yet name. Colonel Morrison, watching the Germans' reactions, said quietly, "War does not reward perfection on the parade ground. It rewards the side that adapts fastest when everything falls apart." Those words lingered in Erica's mind longer than she cared to admit. She told herself she still believed in German superiority. But as she returned to the compound that evening, notebook in hand, she realized her notes contained not just criticism, but questions. And questions, once asked, are difficult to silence. The second morning at Fort Leavenworth began before dawn. A whistle cut through the stillness, followed by the shuffle of boots and the clatter of rifles. Erica Weber, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, joined the other prisoners at the edge of the training ground. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, and a thin fog curled over the prairie grass. This time, the Americans were preparing for a field exercise. Packs were strapped, helmets adjusted, and weapons checked with brisk, practiced motions. Once again, there was none of the rigid order Erica expected. No drill sergeant pacing with a cane. No balked cadence commanding every step. Instead, squad leaders gathered their men in small knots, briefing them in low voices. Then, with little ceremony, they moved out toward the woods. Weber leaned toward one of her fellow prisoners. See how they start. No formation. No synchronization. Each squad like a gang of hunters, not soldiers. She wanted to believe her words. And yet, something about the soldiers' purposeful stride gave her pause. They were relaxed. Yes, but not careless. Colonel Morrison and Captain Williams accompanied the group of German prisoners to a rise overlooking the field. Below them, the exercise unfolded. American squads fanned out through the terrain, each one tasked with securing a series of objectives marked with flags. At first glance, it seemed the chaos Erica had expected. Soldiers darted between trees, in squads separated by distance and foliage. No one barked orders over a radio. There was no constant stream of instructions. Yet, as the minutes passed, a pattern emerged. Squads maneuvered independently, but with a shared sense of timing, each unit adapting to obstacles on its own. Williams, noticing the Germans' confusion, explained, "Every soldier knows the mission, not just the leader everyone. If a squad leader falls, the mission doesn't die with him. The men carry on." Weber stiffened. "Impossible. Soldiers need direction. Without it, they act foolishly. Discipline prevents disaster." Williams did not argue. He simply pointed. On the field, one squad encountered an unexpected barrier. A shallow creek swollen from recent rain. Instead of waiting for orders, two privates found a fallen tree, shoved it into position, and created a makeshift bridge. The squad crossed within minutes and continued toward their objective. A murmur ran through the German prisoners. Weber frowned. She knew what would have happened in her own army. The squad would have halted, radioed their officer, and awaited instructions. Minutes, perhaps half an hour, would have passed. In combat, those minutes could mean survival or destruction. Williams glanced at her. "You see, they didn't wait for permission. They solved the problem. That is why our men succeed." Weber bristled. "Your soldiers are lucky. Improvisation is no substitute for training." But her words rang hollow even to her own ears. She remembered the day of her capture in Normandy. The radio lines cut. Orders delayed. Her unit trapped while they waited for approval from a superior who never replied. In that moment, rigid obedience had not been strength. It had been a death sentence. As the exercise continued, another surprise awaited her. Toward the end, an officer deliberately fell in the simulation, leaving a squad leaderless. To Erica's astonishment, a sergeant immediately took charge, issuing orders without hesitation. When he was hit, a corporal stepped up. Even privates understood what needed to be done. The mission went on seamlessly. Williams turned to the Germans, his voice calm but firm. On the battlefield, radios fail. Officers D. If only one man knows the plan. The plan dies with him. In our army, everyone is expected to think. Everyone carries the mission. Silence hung in the air. The German officers exchanged uneasy glances. For Weber, the scene struck like a blow. She remembered mocking these men as undisciplined farmers. But here they were ordinary soldiers solving problems faster than many German officers would have dared. That night in the barracks, Erica stared at her notes by the dim glow of a lantern. Her pages were filled not with scornful observations, but with contradictions. The Americans' training seemed disorganized, yet it worked. Their soldiers lacked precision, yet they achieved results. And worst of all, their supposed weakness revealed the very flaw that had doomed her own capture. An army too dependent on orders from above. For the first time, Erica could not laugh at what she had seen. For the first time, she felt a creeping suspicion that the Wehrmacht's celebrated discipline was not invincible. She closed her notebook, unsettled. Tomorrow would bring another exercise. And she feared, though she would not admit it yet, that tomorrow might bring more proof she could not ignore. The third day of observation began with a kind of quiet tension. The German prisoners, though still proud, had grown more reserved. Their mocking laughter had faded, replaced by furrowed brows and whispered exchanges. Even Erica Weber, who had once smirked at the sight of undisciplined American troops, now found herself watching with something uncomfortably close to curiosity. Colonel Morrison must have sensed the change. Today, he told them, you will see why our methods look different. Today, we put the men to the real test. The exercise was a simulation of combat without officer supervision. An entire platoon would carry out a mission with minimal guidance from above each squad, left to adapt as situations unfolded. To the Germans, this sounded absurd. Officers were the backbone of command. Without them, how could soldiers possibly coordinate? Weber scribbled that thought in her notebook. If officers are absent, structure collapses. It was, she believed, an unshakable truth of war. The whistle blew. The platoon surged forward into the mock battlefield, a stretch of uneven terrain dotted with obstacles, trenches, and marked enemy positions. Within minutes, the carefully assigned officers were killed in the simulation. Removed from the exercise, the Germans leaned forward, expecting chaos. But chaos never came. Sergeants stepped up instantly, barking orders with clarity. When one was taken out, corporals filled the gap. Even privates, when left alone, pushed forward with determination, carrying out the mission without hesitation. Squads did not freeze. They adapted. Weber's pencil stilled. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. In her own army, such a scenario would have ended in paralysis. Soldiers would have halted, awaiting fresh orders from above, orders that might never come. Then came the moment that shattered her certainty. One squad was tasked with capturing a fortified position. Midway through the assault, the squad leader fell. Instead of retreating, the soldiers quickly regrouped. A private, Barely more than a boy shouted instructions, directing his comrades to flank the position. They executed the maneuver smoothly, catching the defenders off guard. Within minutes, the position was theirs. The German prisoners erupted in disbelief. Impossible. One officer barked. A private cannot lead. William's turn, his voice calm but sharp. And yet he did. Because we trained him not just to follow orders, but to understand the mission. If a leader falls, the mission lives on. That is the difference between surviving and being destroyed. Weber's heart sank. Her mind raced back to Normandy. She remembered the panic when their communications were cut. She remembered the silence of officers waiting for directives that never arrived. She remembered the sense of helplessness of being trapped by obedience. The Americans were showing her in brutal clarity what she had not dared admit. The flaw was not in their training, but in hers. She looked down at her notes. The lines she had written the day before mocking American disorder now mocked her instead. Disorder had become initiative. Sloppiness had become adaptability. What she once saw as weakness revealed itself as strength. As the exercise ended, Morrison spoke quietly, almost with pity. Your army taught you to obey without question. Ours teaches every man to think, to solve, to act. On the battlefield, which do you think survives? Weber could not answer. Her throat tightened, her pride crumbling. For the first time since capture, she felt something she had never associated with the Americans: respect. That night, she sat in her barracks long after the others had gone to sleep, her notebook open on her knees. The words she had written now blurred under her gaze. At last, she tore out a page, crumpled it in her fist, and whispered into the darkness. We lost because we obeyed. The admission was bitter, almost unbearable, but it was the truth. And in that moment, Erica Weber's beliefs, once as rigid as the iron discipline of her army, finally began to break. The next morning, Erica Weber approached the observation field with a different posture. Her notebook, once filled with sharp criticisms, now contained hesitant questions. The sneer that had curled her lips in those first days was gone. In its place was a silent, unsettled curiosity. Captain Williams seemed to notice. After the day's exercise, when the prisoners were gathered under the shade of a cottonwood tree, he turned directly to her. "You've been watching closely," he said. "What do you see now?" Weber hesitated. To admit what she had seen felt like treason against everything she had been taught. But silence would betray her inner turmoil. Finally, she asked, "Did you Americans design your training specifically to defeat us? To counter the German way of war?" Williams shook his head. "No. We didn't shape our doctrine for you. We shaped it for ourselves. It reflects who we are." The words puzzled her. "Who you are? What do you mean?" "Think of it this way," Williams continued. "Every army is a mirror of its nation. Your Wehrmacht grew from Prussian tradition hierarchy, obedience, precision. The Red Army, born of fear and political control. The British balanced discipline with a dose of flexibility from their empire. And us," he gestured toward the soldiers packing their gear. "We are Americans. A country of farmers, frontiersmen, immigrants. Out there, a man can't wait for orders. He solves problems himself. Or he doesn't survive. That's what we teach our soldiers." The explanation struck Weber like a revelation. She had always believed training doctrine was purely military, a science of drills, orders, and manuals. But Williams was saying something deeper. That armies were not isolated machines. They were expressions of culture. In Germany, unquestioning obedience was not just military practice, it was a reflection of society. Generations of Prussian discipline, reinforced by Nazi ideology, had shaped soldiers into instruments rather than thinkers. To disobey was unthinkable. In America, by contrast, independence was woven into the national fabric. From pioneer days to democratic governance, ordinary people were expected to make choices, to take responsibility. That expectation carried into the military. Weber struggled with the thought, but discipline holds an army together. Without it, discipline matters. Williams interrupted gently. But what is discipline? Is it marching in perfect step? Or is it staying calm under fire and finding a way forward when everything goes wrong? She could not answer. For years, she had equated discipline with perfection, with the parade ground. Now, she was being forced to see discipline as something else. Not rigid obedience, but the ability to adapt without breaking. Her mind drifted to the German concept of Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics taught in earlier eras of the German army. Commanders once encouraged subordinates to understand intent and act independently to achieve it. Ironically, her own nation had pioneered the very principle she now saw in practice. But under Hitler's regime, that flexibility had been strangled. Initiative gave way to centralized orders. Fear replaced trust. The irony was bitter. The Americans, whom she had dismissed as amateurs, had embraced the very doctrine her own army had abandoned. Later that evening, Morrison joined Williams and the prisoners for a more informal discussion. He studied Weber carefully. "You've seen how we train. Tell me, Fräulein Weber, are we fools? As you once thought." She lowered her gaze. Admitting the truth out loud was painful, but denial no longer seemed possible. "No," she said quietly. "You are not fools. You prepare for the battlefield as it truly is, not as you wish it to be." Morrison nodded. "That is the difference between armies that endure and armies that collapse." In the silence that followed, Weber realized how far she had come in only a few days. What began as arrogance had given way to doubt, and doubt to reluctant respect. She was no longer mocking what she saw. She was learning from it. And more importantly, she was beginning to see the deeper truth. Wars are not only fought with weapons and tactics. They are fought with the values of the societies that wield them. For Erika Weber, this realization was both humbling and liberating. It meant her world of rigid obedience had not been destiny. It had been a choice that had led her army to disaster. Now, in captivity, she was beginning to imagine a different path. The days turned into weeks, and what began as mere observation became, for Erika Weber, something more profound, a confrontation with her own beliefs. Each morning, she walked out to the training fields with her notebook, ready to collect evidence of American inferiority. But by now, her notes no longer read like critiques. They had become comparisons, sometimes reluctant, sometimes painful, but increasingly honest. She documented how American soldiers trained to repair their weapons in the field, while German troops often relied on specialists, slowing operations. She recorded how American fitness training emphasized endurance, not ceremonial posture, producing men who might lack parade ground elegance, but who could march and fight for days without collapse. She noted that leadership development extended even to privates, as if every soldier might one day be called to command. What struck her most deeply, however, was the way these methods fit together. They were not random quirks of American culture. They formed a philosophy that valued effectiveness over appearances, adaptability over rigidity. One evening, as she reviewed her notes under the dim light of the barracks lamp, Monica Brown leaned over her shoulder. "You're writing more like an analyst than a prisoner," Monica observed. "What do you plan to do with all this?" Weber hesitated. "At first, I thought I would use it against them, document their weaknesses. But now, she sighed, closing the notebook. Now I wonder if it is a record of our own mistakes. The weight of that admission hung between them. For years, they had been told that German superiority was beyond question. Yet here they were, prisoners of war, while these undisciplined Americans prepared to fight across oceans with a confidence their own armies had lost. The implications extended far beyond personal pride. Weber began to see that the future of Germany itself might depend on understanding these lessons. A nation that had built its military culture on obedience and appearance had been defeated by one that built its strength on initiative and practicality. If Germany was to rise from the ruins, it could not simply cling to old myths. The turning point came when Colonel Morrison asked her to compile her observations into a formal report. Not for intelligence, he clarified, but for understanding. History is about to move quickly, he told her. Germany will need people who can explain why it lost, and what it must learn. You could be one of those people. The request shook her. For the first time, she felt the possibility that her role as a prisoner could become something else, a bridge between two worlds. And so, she began to write with purpose. Her report compared doctrines, dissected philosophies, and weighed outcomes. She did not spare her homeland. She admitted, in words that burned as she wrote them, that American methods had produced soldiers better prepared for the chaos of modern war. When Morrison read it, he looked at her with something like admiration. This, he said, tapping the pages, isn't just analysis. It's the beginning of something larger. These ideas could help shape the future. The realization terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She, a captured officer who had once laughed at American sloppiness, was now preparing to teach Germans why their rigid doctrines had failed. The consequences of this shift reached far beyond the fences of Fort Leavenworth. As 1,944 turned to 1,945, Germany's defeat was no longer in doubt. The Reich was collapsing, and with it, the very traditions that had once seemed eternal. But within that collapse lay a question. What would come next? Weber was beginning to glimpse the answer. Military training was not simply about soldiers, it was about the soul of a nation. If Germany wanted to survive in the post-war world, it would need to rethink not only how it fought wars, but how it understood discipline, authority, and responsibility. These were not just military lessons. They were lessons about democracy itself. For Erika Weber, the consequences were personal as well as historical. She had crossed a line from loyal officer of a defeated regime to a reluctant student of her captors. And in doing so, she had found a strange freedom. The freedom to imagine a Germany that could be different. One that might someday learn from its enemies how to build something better. By early 1945, as winter winds swept across Kansas and news of Germany's collapse filtered into the prisoner compounds, Erika Weber's war had already taken a different course. She was no longer simply a captive officer observing the enemy. She had become something else, an unwilling, then reluctant, and finally determined participant in the reshaping of military thought. Colonel Morrison saw it before she did. After reading her report, a frank, methodical analysis comparing German and American training philosophies, he summoned her once again to his office, overlooking the Fort Leavenworth drill fields. Outside, American recruits slogged through mud, adjusting to a simulated battlefield scenario. Inside, Morrison leaned back in his chair, tapping the edge of her report with a pencil. "You've done more than compare training methods," he said. "You've captured the difference between two cultures. And whether you realize it or not, you've begun answering the question Germany will face after this war. How to build an army that reflects a new society." Weber stiffened. "I am a prisoner. My duty is not to shape the future of Germany." Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly. Not in rebuke, but in calculation. Perhaps not your duty, he said evenly, but it may be your opportunity. The words stayed with her long after she left his office. An opportunity. She had never thought of her captivity in such terms. Yet the truth was undeniable. Her observations, her reluctant respect for American methods, her ability to translate between two worlds, these gave her a role no one else could play. When Morrison finally extended the proposal, she felt the weight of it fully. He asked her to assist in developing educational materials for post-war German officers' training manuals, lecture notes, comparative studies. At first, the very idea felt disloyal. To aid the enemy in re-educating Germans. Treason. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized Germany would not be rebuilt by clinging to illusions of past glory. If she refused, others would write the story for her people. Perhaps with less understanding or less sympathy. Better, she decided, that the truth come from one who had lived both sides. And so she accepted. Not as a collaborator, she told herself, but as a witness, a teacher. Her first presentations were informal, delivered to groups of German prisoners under American supervision. She stood before men who had once shared her unshakable belief in German military superiority, and she told them what she had seen. She described American fitness that prized endurance over posture, leadership that demanded initiative from the lowest ranks, decision-making distributed through non-commissioned officers rather than locked in officers' corps. The reactions were mixed. Some scoffed openly, dismissing her words as propaganda. Others listened in silence, their faces betraying a dawning recognition they did not wish to admit. A few approached her afterward in private, thanking her for speaking truths they themselves had begun to suspect. Monica Brown, ever the realist, supported her. Better they hear it from you than from an American officer, Monica whispered one night. They can call it propaganda when it comes from their captors. But when it comes from you, one of their own, it forces them to think. The Americans noticed, too. Captain Williams, who had once sparred with her over definitions of discipline, attended one of her talks and afterward remarked, "You're not just teaching Germans. You're teaching us as well that victory isn't only about weapons, but about ideas." By spring 1945, the program was formalized. Weber was no longer merely a POW. She was reassigned as a civilian educator under military supervision. It was a strange halfway world still within the confines of captivity, yet entrusted with authority over others. Her lectures expanded, reaching not only prisoners but also German civilians who were preparing for the monumental task of rebuilding their shattered country. The Americans gave her access to training materials, officer seminars, and even planning sessions for post-war reconstruction. At first, she felt like an intruder, but gradually she recognized her unique position. She could speak both languages, the rigid dialect of German command culture and the flexible, pragmatic vocabulary of American doctrine. And so her new mission crystallized, not to betray her homeland, but to prepare it for survival in a world where old myths had led only to ruin. At night, she wrote in her journal with the clarity of someone who had shed illusions. I once believed discipline was measured in parade steps. Now I know it is measured in survival. I once believed obedience was the highest virtue. Now I know it is adaptability. Our men were never superior. We simply believed our own lies until the truth crushed us. If Germany is to rise again, it must learn not from its victories, but from its defeats. Her new mission was not easy. She was called a traitor by some, an idealist by others, and occasionally even doubted herself. But as the Reich collapsed and the world looked to the future, Erika Weber understood that her work had only just begun. For the first time in years, she felt not like a captive, but like someone with a purpose. The Reich fell in May 1945. News of Hitler's suicide, of Berlin's collapse, of unconditional surrender, all of it reached Fort Leavenworth in fragments. Radio bulletins, officers' briefings, rumors whispered among the prisoners. For some, the defeat was unthinkable. For others, it was a dark relief. For Erika Weber, it was confirmation. The illusions of invincibility she had once clung to had crumbled entirely. Germany was broken, not only its cities, but its beliefs. And with that collapse came the challenge she had anticipated. What next? The Americans wasted little time. Even as Europe smoldered, plans were drawn for the occupation, demilitarization, and eventual reconstruction of Germany. Among those plans was the question of the German military. What form, if any, it might take in a democratic society? At first, the answer seemed simple: abolish it altogether. The Wehrmacht had been too complicit, too corrupted, too obedient to a tyrant. But as tensions with the Soviet Union sharpened almost immediately after victory, the Allies realized a paradox. Germany, though defeated, would soon be needed as a partner in Europe's defense. A new army would have to be built, not the Wehrmacht reborn, but something different, something aligned with democracy. It was here that Erika found her strange new role. Released from POW status in late 1946, but retained as an educational advisor under Allied supervision, she began working with small groups of German officers who were being screened for possible future service. These men, hardened by war and humiliation, carried with them the same pride and prejudice she had once borne. Many still muttered about American disorder and German superiority. Erika faced them without flinching. She had been where they stood. She understood their scorn, their reluctance to learn from the enemy. And so she did not lecture from a pedestal. Instead, she told her own story, how she, too, had mocked the Americans, how she had laughed at their apparent sloppiness, and how those very qualities had proved decisive. Her candor disarmed them. They could not dismiss her as a propagandist. She had worn the same uniform they had, shared the same convictions, and endured the same defeat. Slowly, some began to listen. Together with Allied officers, Erika helped draft new instructional materials. These emphasized not rigid obedience, but Verantwortung responsibility. Non-commissioned officers were trained not just as executors of orders, but as leaders expected to think and act independently. Physical training shifted from parade drills to field endurance. War-gaming exercises replaced rote marching. At first, the changes met resistance. Old officers grumbled that discipline was eroding. But gradually, as young recruits adapted quickly and efficiently, the value of the new approach became undeniable. One of the pivotal moments came when Erika was invited to lecture at a training seminar in occupied Germany in 1948. Standing before a hall of former Wehrmacht officers, now cautiously engaged in discussions about a future German defense force, she spoke with steady conviction. Gentlemen, our downfall was not inevitable. It was the product of choices. Choices to silence initiative, to exalt obedience, to confuse appearance with reality. You ask what kind of army Germany might one day need. I answer you this: one that prepares its soldiers for freedom, not for submission. For only soldiers who think freely can defend a free nation. The hall was silent. Some bristled. Others looked away. But a few nodded, faintly, almost imperceptibly. Those few would later become the seed of the Bundeswehr. The new German army formed in the 1952nd under NATO, though her name would never appear in official doctrines or public speeches. Erika's influence lingered in the undercurrent of reform. Her reports, her lectures, Her insistence on facing uncomfortable truths, all of it contributed to a slow but decisive shift in German military culture. By the time the Bundeswehr was founded in 1955, its principles bore little resemblance to the Wehrmacht she had once served. Mission-type tactics, Auftragstaktik, had been revived, but this time anchored in democratic accountability. Soldiers were taught not only to obey, but also to question unlawful orders. Leadership training emphasized ethical responsibility alongside battlefield initiative. The very flaws that had doomed the old army became lessons for the new. For Erika, now living quietly as a civilian educator in Frankfurt, the transformation was both vindication and relief. She had helped, in her small way, to ensure that Germany's future soldiers would not be the blind instruments of tyranny she herself had once been. And though history would remember generals and statesmen more than a former POW at Fort Leavenworth, she carried a private knowledge that her journey from mockery to respect, from arrogance to humility, had mirrored the journey her country itself was forced to take. Germany had been broken, but from that breaking, something new, something freer was being built. Years later, long after the war had ended and the barbed wire of Fort Leavenworth had been replaced by memories, Erika Weber would sometimes sit by the window of her Frankfurt apartment, listening to the quiet rhythm of a city reborn. Children played in the streets where once rubble had choked every alley. Soldiers in fresh uniforms patrolled not as conquerors but as protectors. Germany, though scarred, had found its way back into the world. In those moments, she often thought of that first September morning in 1944, the day she had laughed at the sight of American soldiers drilling in the Kansas sun. She remembered the certainty in her voice, the smugness in her notes, and how utterly convinced she had been that Germany's way of war was the only way. Now, with distance, she understood that moment for what it truly was. The beginning of her education. Her experience had left her with lessons that reached far beyond military barracks or battlefields. They were lessons about leadership, about culture, and about the fragile balance between obedience and freedom. She had learned that an army's strength was not measured by the sharpness of its salutes or the perfection of its parade lines, but by the capacity of its soldiers to think, adapt, and act when the unexpected struck. She had learned that discipline, stripped of humanity, could become a prison, that the blind obedience she once admired had been the very instrument of her nation's ruin. And perhaps most profoundly, she had learned that militaries reflect the societies they serve. The Wehrmacht's rigid hierarchy was born of a culture that feared dissent and exalted authority. The U.S. Army's flexibility grew out of a society that prized independence and individual initiative. The question was never simply which tactics worked better. It was always, which values are you willing to entrust to the next generation? As Germany rebuilt, she watched with cautious pride as the Bundeswehr embraced this lesson. Soldiers were no longer expected to surrender their conscience at the barracks gate. Instead, they were trained as citizens in uniform, men and women whose loyalty to democracy stood above blind obedience to orders. And she knew then that her time at Fort Leavenworth had not been wasted, because the story was never just about one officer or one army. It was about the clash between two visions of human responsibility, one that demanded unquestioning obedience, and another that trusted ordinary individuals to bear the weight of command when history placed it on their shoulders. That clash still echoes today, in every military that drills recruits to obey without asking why, in every organization where leaders hoard authority and fear initiative, in every society that confuses order with strength. Erika Weber's journey from arrogance to humility, from prisoner to teacher, stands as a reminder that strength does not lie in rigid control, but in the courage to think and act responsibly. And if there was one truth she carried with her until the end of her life, it was this: armies that teach obedience may conquer for a season. Armies that teach responsibility endure for generations.